Hello, everyone. Welcome to my podcast, Financially Yours, where I will share my perspectives on everyday economic and financial issues. As you all know, two major earthquakes of sizes 7.8 and 7.5 magnitude struck southern Turkey and northwestern Syria on Monday, February 6, 2023. 4 weeks after the earthquakes, Turkish President Erdogan said on March 6 that the death toll in Turkey was more than 46,000. It is 51,000 including Syria. Today I have Dr. Robert Stern from University of Texas, Dallas with me. Let me spell his name for you, S-T-E-R-N. Welcome, Bob. Can you please introduce yourself to my listeners?
Sure. I'm a professor of Geosciences at the University of Texas at Dallas. I've been here 42 years. I specialize in plate tectonics and things related to it. And I have a long-term interest in the very interesting tectonics of the Middle East, including Turkey.
Okay, before talking about Turkey, can you please walk us through plate tectonics? What are they? How many plates are there in the world and in Turkey? How fast do they move? And why are they important?
There are 7 major plates and then many smaller ones. One of the plates is the Anatolian plate, which most of Turkey is on. And just to the south is the Arabian plate, which Saudi Arabia, Syria, Iraq, they're on that. And to the north is the Eurasian plate. So the Anatolian plate is caught between the Arabian plate and the Eurasian plate. All of these plates move independently and for different reasons. There's places where plates are coming together. There's places where plates are moving apart. There's places where plates are sliding by each other. And in Turkey, the disaster was caused by a plate boundary between the Anatolian plate and the Arabian plate along one of these what we call strike-slip faults, where the two plates are moving past each other. Turkey is moving westward relative to Arabia. Now, the plates move very slowly, typically at rates that correspond to how fast your hair grows or how fast your fingernails grow. Those are sort of the limits of plate motion. But in many situations, plates don't move continuously. They lock up. And in those situations, what we call strain accumulates, which is basically rocks deform more and more as you could think about it as tectonic pressure builds up and then it is finally released. The plates move and you have an earthquake. The more they move, the bigger the earthquake. The earthquake.
But you said that they move continuously. So how does an earthquake happen?
Where they move smoothly, they move continuously, but sometimes they lock up along certain segments of fault. Some, everything's more complicated than we explain it. But in the case of the East Anatolian Fault, which was the culprit, the plate motion was locked up for many years. And so it was released all at once. So if you think about how much motion would be required to catch up to, let's say, 100 years of small strain. Let's say the East Anatolian Fault is moving at 10 millimeters a year. I don't know how fast it's moving, but it's not going to be much more than that. We like that because that 10 millimeters a year is 100 millimeters in 10 years, or 1,000 millimeters or a meter in 100 years. What happened in the East Anatolian Fault is, instead of the two plates being able to move simply and continuously by each other, a segment locked up and strain was accumulated over decades, if not hundreds of years, and then was suddenly released in one terrible event. So if we could get all of the faults to move continuously, then these things would never happen. But when they lock up, then the pressure builds, and then all of a sudden it's released in a single terrifying event. And that's what happened on February 6th.
Okay, so it said that the sizes are 7.8 and 7.5. So can you please compare this to other earthquakes or similar magnitude? I think I read your report that you sent a couple of days ago that you were mentioning about Chile.
Yeah, so the first thing is you have to understand the earthquake magnitude scale. So it's not a very simple increase. Moving from, say, a magnitude 6 to a magnitude 7 is 33 times more energy. So a magnitude 7 earthquake is immensely more powerful than a magnitude 6. And a magnitude 8 is immensely more powerful than a magnitude 7. Now, fortunately, like many things, the big things happen rarely and the little things happen all the time. So there's earthquakes going on all the time, magnitudes 3 and lower, we don't even notice them. You know, you have to have instruments to even notice that there was an earthquake. But once you get up to magnitude 4 and 5, you feel it if you're nearby. And magnitude 6, there's going to be some damage if buildings are not well built. Magnitude 7, there's going to be a lot of damage. Magnitude 8, it's going to be catastrophic. And the two earthquakes were magnitude 7.8, which was the first one, almost an 8. And the second one was a 7.5, which is not that much weaker. So these were two very powerful earthquakes. We're fortunate that in most years, there's like one magnitude 8 and maybe a dozen magnitude 7s. And these usually happen far away, out in the oceans or in uninhabited regions where nobody is bothered. But these terrible earthquakes happen in a very densely populated region. So the damage that an earthquake does increases the closer you get to where the earthquake happened. And these cities were right on the fault and very close to what we call the epicenter of the earthquake. And the earthquakes were shallow too, so that made it bad as well. If an earthquake is deep, you don't feel it nearly as much. A shallow earthquake right under a city of this size is absolutely catastrophic.
Yesterday, it was announced that 45,000 people died. Is it normal, like comparing to other earthquakes?
No.
Or
I
what's the
mean,
main?
Turkey had a very big earthquake, what, in 1999 or 97?
It was 99. Yeah, I was there in Istanbul.
Like 17,000 people died. So that's a lot. And that's the previously big death toll. 50,000 people dying is very unusual, thank goodness.
What do you think the main cause of high death toll?
Oh, I think it's construction. Earthquakes don't kill people, it's buildings that kill people. So Haiti had a fairly mild earthquake, a magnitude 6, and about 300,000 people died because so many buildings collapsed. Other places like Japan, you know, the 2011 magnitude 8 over 8, that resulted in very few deaths from the earthquake itself. Most of them died from the tsunami that it caused. You know, there was no tsunami associated with the Turkish earthquake because the earthquake wasn't in the ocean. But it's clear that the building standards need to be greatly improved. That's task number one for the people of Turkey, is to figure out how to build better buildings in these very earthquake-prone regions.
So is it related to state of mind or technology or both?
No, the technology is there, but as you know, people want their house as cheap as possible, right? And you can imagine that how many people live in Turkey now?
Around 80 million, maybe?
Yeah, 80 million, and more houses are needed all the time. I don't know about building codes, but with as many buildings collapsing as did, certainly part of the reason is this incredibly strong earthquake that happened in a densely populated region. But many fewer people would have died if the buildings were built better.
Is it true that most of the earthquakes happen at night?
No,
Any idea?
that was another part of the tragedy, is this earthquake happened when people were in their beds early in the morning. Earthquakes happen around the clock. The earth doesn't notice what time it is.
Are there any specific geological characteristics that make Turkey particularly vulnerable to earthquakes?
Yes, it's got two major faults. that bound the plate. Both of them are what we call strike-slip faults, where the two plates are sliding by each other. Our attention had been, so there's one in the north called the North Anatolian Fault, which goes right to Istanbul. And there was a whole sequence of earthquakes along it, marching from east to west towards Istanbul. And our concern had been focused on the Northern Anatolian Fault. The East Anatolian Fault, which bounds the Arabian and the Anatolian plate, we paid less attention to it because it wasn't as active. But it's those two faults where the danger is, the greatest danger is. Earthquakes happen in other regions, but those are the things that.
But it's possible to measure the movement of the plates, right? So how much they move every year, so that
Yeah.
would that give you an idea about the possibility of an earthquake?
Okay, earthquakes can't be predicted. Their locations can be, you can argue that there's a higher risk of an earthquake, a damaging earthquake along a major plate boundary. That is true. But when that damaging earthquake is going to happen is difficult to know. But one of the things that's useful is to understand the recurrence intervals. So big earthquakes don't happen randomly along these faults. They occur where the stress has built up to a certain point, and then there's a catastrophic release of energy. But that it takes a while to build up that stress. So let's imagine that we could go back into the historical records and see, back. I imagine Turkey has historical records going back hundreds and thousands of years, and just said, okay, it seems like every 150 years there's a bad earthquake in this region along this fault. Then you could say, okay, we should be more prepared in these regions where there hasn't been a big earthquake for that time than in regions just had a big earthquake. It seems counterintuitive, but the regions that were devastated, they've released most of their strain. And so it will probably be fairly safe to live there for several decades, whereas other regions, adjoining regions along the fault, where there haven't had a big release of energy, a big earthquake, may be more vulnerable. So one of the things that people need to understand is the recurrence interval of major earthquakes along these two major faults. So they can say, okay, this region is most likely to get a big earthquake. We should concentrate building the safest housing possible here.
That brings my next question then. How can people living in the earthquake-prone zones better prepare themselves, like building better houses?
Well, I mean, there's, number one is to think about what's going to happen if a big earthquake comes. My grown children live in California near the San Andreas Fault, and I'm always telling them that they should be able to get out of their bedroom. They should keep water. For example, if your water gets cut off, which it often does, don't flush your toilet. You've got in the back of your toilet, you've got clean water, quite a bit of it. But keep other water, keep some food. This situation is very, very bad. People are, and basically, I was hearing on the radio last night, people haven't been able to do even the most basic things for weeks now. This is an unusually bad earthquake, but you need to be prepared for an earthquake. And people don't think about the fact that, when an earthquake happens, even if the building doesn't collapse, it will shift and it may be impossible to open your door to get out of your apartment. And if there's a fire, that could be a catastrophe. So it's useful to, leave your doors open or to have a big axe so that you can break through your doors if you need to get out of the building, or to have some kind of a rope ladder that lets you get down from the windows. But just thinking about how you're going to deal with an earthquake that is, say, magnitude 6, and your building shifts and the doors won't open, and you need to get out of the building, and also to be prepared in terms of food and water, flashlights.
So not just the construction of the building, but also preparation should also be in place. Is that right?
And then, yeah, preparation is absolutely, that's what each of us can do. Is we can't rebuild the houses we live in, but we can have supplies and the necessary things.
Is Texas in earthquake region?
Oh, no.
No?
We
Okay.
have small earthquakes, but if we have anything like what you had in Turkey, it will be a terrible surprise.
What's the most like earthquake prone regions in the United States? Is it California?
Oh, California, the San Andreas Fault that's very similar to the North Anatolian Fault and the East Anatolian Fault. It's a strike slip fault that's moving. And, the 1906 earthquake leveled San Francisco. There'll
So
be another one.
It hasn't been any earthquake since then, 400 years?
Not ones of that magnitude. I mean, definitely there have been earthquakes. They had an earthquake in, I think it was 1987. It caused significant damage.
Do you remember their magnitudes?
It's like a magnitude 6.
Mm-hmm. How about 1908?
Oh, and 1906 was a
6, I'm
magnitude
sorry.
close to about an 8. It was a
Oh,
big one.
wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So Turkish government is starting construction of more than 200,000 homes across the earthquake zone in March. So they either already started or they are starting in a couple of days. So what measures should, well, all governments, but specifically Turkish government, take to reduce the risk of disasters like this?
There's a number of ways to think about dealing with the highest housing crisis. One of them is to spread out so that people are living in one-story buildings.
Mm-hmm.
Or 2-story buildings. Now that creates sprawl, but those are safer buildings than building 3-story, 10-story buildings.
There were a lot of like multiple story buildings there,
Yeah.
10, probably even more.
They were death traps. They collapsed, and if they're going to build taller buildings, they have to be engineered better, and they have to be inspected better. So the entire construction industry needs to be rethought. Especially in these earthquake zones. We have housing crises everywhere. And so one way to deal with that is just put up a lot of cheap housing.
Cut the corners.
But then you could end up with something like this. And we know which situation we'd rather be in now. We'd much rather have more expensive buildings that are still standing than so many dead people because the buildings were built poorly. But it needs to be thought out carefully, and the problem is there's not much time. If you're going to build high buildings, build them safely.
Like let's come to science. So I watched one of your videos. This was about subduction zones. Maybe you might want to mention those, but so you are complaining about the visualization and animations related to these. So you say, quote, "We should be ashamed of ourselves." So what's the problem with like teaching people using visualizations and animations?
Well, the problem is the world now is all about videos, right? Students, and our students face something that's unfamiliar. The first thing they do is go to YouTube and they look for something there to explain it. Now, the scientific community is a world of grants and publications. So you move up the scientific ladder by having more important papers and more funding. There's no ladder, there's no incentive to make videos. Now, the people that do make videos, often they don't have the information. So, for example, one of the scientific organizations did a study of the videos on YouTube about global warming. And what they found was that there were more videos about jet contrails than there were about explaining what is actually happening with fossil fuels and deforestation and things like that. I mean, I imagine there's people that will say that this earthquake was a judgment of Allah or whatever, or Israel or whoever. And there's a lot of misinformation on these videos. And the only way to combat misinformation is with information. And the problem is that the people that have the information don't have the skills or the time to make good videos. A good video has got production qualities, there's visual elements that explain things. right now, science funding agencies don't see much use for videos. They're focused on papers and patents and
So
things.
you are basically praising podcasts too.
Right. I mean, these are ways of getting information, right? You've reached out to me because I have some content
Mhm.
that you think is valuable to share, and that's different than talking to. I'm sure you could have a podcast with a crazy mullah who said this is God's judgment on all of the bad people that live in this area. But I mean, that's a podcast too, I imagine.
Yeah, that's easier to find. Well, once again, thank you for accepting this offer. So what technological advances can be implemented to better monitor seismic activity and alert people to potential risks? So are we having better technological advances, or we keep using
Well,
the
one of
same?
the most important ones is with all of the cell phones. So there's a sequence of signals that comes from an earthquake. The first signal is not the damaging one. And the second one isn't usually the damaging one either, but the third and fourth one are. So
So what
depending
do you
on
mean?
how
Can you clarify it? What do you mean, like
well
signal?
the movement inside the earth sets up two main kinds of waves, body waves and surface waves. So
Mhm.
body waves transmit through the planet and arrive at the surface. Surface waves travel along the surface. And there are two kinds of body waves, and there are two kinds of surface waves. And the two kinds of body waves arrive before the more damaging surface waves. So let's say the problem is fire. I don't know how big of a problem fire was after the earthquake, but in San Francisco in 1906, everybody is using wood stoves or kerosene, and those stoves got knocked over and buildings burnt. I mean, half the city burnt down. Now people use natural gas, and many cities have natural gas pipelines. But what you can do is set up a system that shuts off the natural gas based on the first seismic wave, so that when the damaging seismic wave arrives a few seconds later, the system's already ready for it, so that reducing the risk of fire. That seems to be happening. I don't know about Turkey's natural gas system. My memory of the Middle East is that everybody had propane tanks, and they just would go down to the market and buy a propane tank when they needed it.
I don't know specifically the earthquake region, but in many cities there are natural gas. In Istanbul, for example, we were using natural gas, but
Is
I
a
don't know.
pipeline coming through
Yeah,
pipeline?
it's pipeline. Yeah, it's pipeline.
Yeah, so they may have that system. But certainly Istanbul should be reevaluating its earthquake preparedness strategy, because as I was telling you earlier, there was this sequence of earthquakes along the North Anatolian Fault, which goes right into Istanbul,
Mhm.
started in the far east and has been slowly marching westward with time. And the one of the big fears is the next earthquake should hit Istanbul. So Istanbul has as much warning as it's likely to get of the next earthquake, the next big earthquake. And the question should be for its leaders, how prepared are they? In California, they did what they call retrofitting, which was to put some steel frames on the outside of some of the older buildings to give them more strength. Because the real damage is by the shaking, the back and forth shaking. And that, in tall buildings, that sets up a resonance and collapses. But if you can make them more rigid, they won't. They're gonna be able to sustain more energy and not collapse.
What kind of research is being done to better understand the factors with respect to maybe like 50 years ago?
I think one of the things of research where it's needed is to understand these locking zones. What is controlling whether or not a thing locks? So in California on the San Andreas, there's segments of the fault that are moving continuously. People can see their drive waves being slowly moved year after year, but that region is not locking. And there's other regions that are very locked. The energy is going to get stored until there's going to be a catastrophic earthquake. For Turkey, the question is, where are the locking zones and what's controlling them? is there any way to relieve some of that built up energy? 10 small earthquakes is better than one big one. If we could somehow engineer, maybe by injecting fluids into the fault and sort of having a preventative earthquake,
So you're talking about just creating a literal man-made earthquake?
Yes, and making little earthquakes to relieve some of the energy. Now, the problem is, of course, you can't control the earthquake size, but you do know that an earthquake that's built up 10 years of strain is going to be weaker than one that's built up 100 years of strain. That's pie in the sky, but it's like forest fires. Like they sometimes will have what they call controlled burns to make it so that when a fire does come, it doesn't have all of the fuel that it would take to make a terrible fire. So it's kind of like a controlled burn, controlled earthquakes.
Are you aware of this practice? Did anybody do it before?
Not that I'm aware of. There's too much concern about any earthquake. So people probably would say, "You're trying to cause us an earthquake? We've just suffered a terrible."
This might be a great headline for the podcast. Bob is asking for a man-made earthquake.
I trust you to not make me look evil. So it's easy to edit and make me look like a mad.
No way. I mean, no way.
But it does get attention if you can portray something, a crazy idea, And it is a little crazy, right?
We can make it less crazy, Bob. Well, okay. I think this was a really great conversation. Are there any recommendations that you would suggest for improving the overall safety and resilience of the communities in the earthquake prone areas? Like any kind of recommendation, just to conclude.
I mean, the government can do things, which is to understand these faults and their motions better and to force builders to build safer buildings. And the people can do things to be prepared for an earthquake that hopefully will not come, but you want to be ready when it does. And the community organizations are important too. The religious organizations can play a big role in educating people about, not so much about God's judgment, but about how do we take care of ourselves during an emergency. And the emergency in that part of Turkey that you worry about, everybody's had their eyes on the civil war in Syria. The emergency that part of Turkey needs to be aware of are terrible earthquakes. And, just educating people, getting people to be prepared, getting people to work together. That's the only hope there is, right?
Oh, yeah.
There's got to be people that have a foot in both the religious and the scientific camps. We just have to keep trying to communicate and, let what we understand be shared and hope that it leads to people wanting to find out more information on their own.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. That was a very insightful conversation.
Okay, same to you.
Bye-bye. This concludes my conversation with Bob, Dr. Robert Stern. I hope you enjoyed it, and I also hope that this podcast would serve as a basis for Turkey and all other earthquake-prone countries to devise strategies and tools to better cope with earthquake problems. As always, you can reach me via Twitter and email. My Twitter handle is dr.orhanerdem, which is D as in Delta, R as in Romeo, my first name and my last name together. My email is orhanerdem@gmail.com, which is my first name and last name together, orhanerdem@gmail.com. Hope to see you in the next episodes. Financially yours.